The house was empty, and silence filled every corner. With everyone gone, she had a rare moment to herself. She exhaled a sigh, feeling both the weight of the quietness and the strange freedom it brought. Her husband was out of town, and the loneliness felt deeper than usual. These feelings weren't new, they had grown slowly over time, creeping into her heart and settling there. She had tried to ignore the pangs of solitude, the longing for affection and excitement that her marriage had once brought. But lately, these feelings had grown harder to ignore. She knew it was wrong to let her mind wander, to feel such restlessness. Yet, the pull was undeniable. Curiosity whispered in her ear, urging her to find a release, to let go for just a moment and escape into something, anything, that felt alive. She found herself thinking of him, her stepson. He was young, confident, and easygoing, bringing an energy into the house that disrupted the monotony she had grown used to. There was something about him that stirred a strange, forbidden thrill within her, something she didn't fully understand or want to admit. She scolded herself for even entertaining the thought, brushing it off as a passing moment of weakness. But once the thought had entered her mind, it was hard to push it aside completely. Her husband had been gone more often, leaving her feeling like a shadow in her own home, just moving through the motions without passion or purpose. She longed to feel wanted, to feel seen. And tonight, with no one around, the feeling of isolation only grew stronger. She allowed herself to drift into fantasy, her mind weaving scenes of warmth, laughter, and closeness that had been absent for so long. It felt wrong, but in the privacy of her thoughts, she could indulge a little, let herself feel what she needed to feel. She moved carefully, closing her eyes, her body responding to the quiet yearning she had pushed down for so long. She barely heard the soft creak of the door or the faint rustle of footsteps. Her senses were too caught up in her own world, unaware that her private thoughts were about to be shattered by an unexpected presence. The moment was hers, an escape she so desperately craved, and she sank into it without reserve. And then, a sound, a breath, a movement, something that broke the silence just enough to make her heart leap. She opened her eyes, her body freezing in place, and saw him standing there. His gaze was locked on her, confusion and shock flashing in his eyes. The air between them felt charged, thick with emotions neither of them could name. Her heart raced, embarrassment flooding her face as she tried to gather herself, feeling suddenly exposed in every sense. She wanted to explain, to say something that would undo the awkwardness, but words failed her. They both stood there, caught in a moment neither could escape, with the silence of the house now feeling more alive than he. He hadn't meant to come back early. He'd forgotten his phone and slipped back into the house quietly, not expecting anyone to be home. But there she was, completely lost in her own world, unaware of his presence. He knew he should look away, that he should leave before she noticed him, but he was frozen in place, unable to process what he was seeing. His mind raced, torn between shock and an unexplainable urge to keep watching. She was someone he'd always respected, someone who'd always been in his life in a distant but stable way. Seeing her like this, though, completely broke that image. She seemed so different, vulnerable, human, lost in a side of herself he never imagined he'd witness. He felt his pulse quicken, shame creeping in as he realized he had lingered too long. In that instant, she sensed him and turned, her eyes meeting his. A flash of panic washed over her face, and her entire body tensed. She looked away, cheeks flushed, as if searching for words that wouldn't come. They both stood there, bound by a silence too heavy to break. She tried to gather herself, her voice shaky when she finally managed a whisper, but it was barely more than a broken apology. She pulled herself up, regaining her composure, and he could see the shame in her eyes. He felt the urge to say something reassuring, anything to ease the awkwardness, but words failed him. He wasn't sure what he could say or how he even felt. He wasn't angry, but he was confused, his mind trying to make sense of what had just happened. Without another word, she hurried past him, each step heavy with embarrassment. He was left standing alone, trying to process the strange whirlwind of emotions inside him. Part of him knew he should forget the whole thing, pretend it never happened. Yet, that was easier said than done. Every time he tried to push the memory away, it came rushing back, vivid and undeniable. As he stood there, he felt the intensity of the moment linger, stirring up a sense of curiosity he couldn't ignore. He knew this was something he should let go of, something he should keep hidden deep within, but his mind wouldn't let him. She was a presence in his life he had always seen one way, yet now that view had shifted, giving way to an uncomfortable, forbidden intrigue. They avoided each other for the rest of the evening, both unable to act naturally, both shaken by the encounter. He caught glimpses of her, catching the flicker of her eyes before she looked away, as if fearing that another second would give away too much. They had crossed a line they hadn't intended to, and now it felt like they were on the edge of something they couldn't predict or control. That night, as he lay in bed, his mind kept wandering back to her. It wasn't anger or shame he felt, but something far more complex. He closed his eyes, wondering how they would face each other tomorrow, knowing nothing could truly undo the memory they now shared. The next day, they both tried to go about their routines, pretending the incident hadn't happened. But every time they crossed paths, the air grew thick with an unspoken tension. She kept her eyes down, her face carefully composed, yet he could feel the hesitation in her every movement. It was as if they were both walking a tightrope, afraid to tip too far in any direction. But avoiding each other completely was impossible. Late in the afternoon, a small, unexpected moment forced them into the same room. She glanced at him briefly, her eyes holding a flicker of apology, maybe even vulnerability. He took a deep breath, feeling an urge to ease her discomfort. Without fully thinking, he muttered an awkward apology, saying he hadn't meant to intrude, hoping it might lessen the weight between them. To his surprise, she let out a small, relieved laugh, the tension between them easing just a little. She thanked him, her voice barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile calm they had managed to find. They both looked away, an awkward silence settling once again. But somehow, that small exchange felt like a bridge, a tiny step toward understanding the complex emotions they were both feeling. Hesitantly, their conversation deepened. She spoke about feeling isolated, the difficulties of maintaining an appearance of happiness while feeling increasingly alone. He listened, surprised by the honesty in her words, recognizing her loneliness mirrored his own. He admitted that he, too, often felt adrift, unsure of his place in the family, struggling to find where he fit in. In their shared vulnerability, the distance between them seemed to shrink. They found themselves discussing things